So you mentioned the kind of the vulnerabilities there, with it being Windows and, in some cases, 365 and whatnot. Um, what can we do to minimize those things? I've heard you mention the 3-2-1 rule
Right.
a ton of times. It always comes up in every single podcast, I guess,
Yeah.
from that photographer chap. Um,
Yeah.
so, and what other things, I hear lots of buzzwords being thrown around about air gapping, immutability. What does all that mean in terms of protecting?
Yeah. So there's sort of two things that we need to protect from a backup system. One is protect the backups from being deleted or encrypted. Right. That's the old style. And by the way, when I say old style, it's not like that has stopped. That is
Right.
still prominent. Right. It's just that
Mhm.
they have added this extortion. So you need to protect the data from being essentially obliterated in a backup, and that's I'm sorry, in an attack. That's what the 3-2-1 rule is about, right? So three copies of the data on two different media, one of which is stored somewhere else.
Mhm.
That's about getting at least one copy of the data into an area that is impervious to the attacks, to whatever might happen to your primary data, right? So this could be a disaster, a fire, a flood, or a cyber attack, right? If they gain access
Sure.
to your backup server via Active Directory or whatever, then what do they have access to? And if all your backups are sitting there on the same server, that's not in keeping with the 3-2-1 rule. And if they're directly copied, so let me back up. So 10 10 years ago, the answer would have most likely been get the cutting edge design would have been buy a target deduplication appliance, right? So this is just a disk array that's specially configured for backups that does what we call deduplication, which just eliminates duplicates inside the file. So you get a lot more bang for your buck out of the storage, right? And then that could replicate to another deduplication system, and that could be offsite. So you've conformed with the 3-2-1 rule in the old sense. But now, if that's replicated to another system, that system is still electronically accessible to my backup server that has now been compromised. So it could potentially be wiped out, just like the primary system. So modern day, we have to think about all of the things that could happen to the backup server. One of which is um, the backups, that are being taken over by a bad actor.
Sure.
So that 3-2-1 rule still applies, but you have to think about it in a new way. There are a bunch of things that you asked me a very open-ended question. I don't know how long you want me to talk. I mean, there are a bunch of
Yeah, I mean,
things.
yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
good.
So I'll give you a quick list, and we can talk about them. We need to talk about authentication and authorization of the backup system. We need to talk about where and how your backups are stored on disk. We need to talk about hardening the OS itself. And we need to talk about, well, I think that would pretty much cover it, right? So, first, I'm curious to know what your opinion is about it just in general, the current sort of best practices seems to be to use laps, right? For Active Directory, to use Active Directory, but to use laps so that you have local passwords on each system, but they're still stored in Active Directory. What you have any thoughts on that?
Um, from a technical perspective, probably not so well versed in that area.
Okay, so
Where I would say going back to what you finished with just a minute ago, in terms of kind of the ransomware things, um, we're helping to stop that actually taking place. So, if
right,
there's a ransomware in progress, files getting encrypted. I'm guessing also on the backup, we we alert to that, and scripts run off the back of that automatically to shut down that user or that file server.
Right,
So
right.
to minimize the scope
impact.
of the impact, exactly. But
Yeah,
I don't think that answers your question.
you don't. Yeah. Well, it's just it's one of these questions that I talk to a lot of people about. I have a very strong opinion that is, I think, contrary to the general way that people do, is they use LAPS, which I think it stands for Local Administrative Password System, I think.
Okay.
Right. It's just a way to have a local password for administrator, but
Right.
to keep it in Active Directory. And I hate this idea. Okay.
I see.
For the backup server specifically, because of everything that I've been talking about, I think that the backup server should be as firewalled, as separate, as difficult to log into as any server, as the most critical server in the data center, because it is your last line of defense, right? It is the firewall. It is, there is no, it's Helm's Deep, if you will, right?
Sure.
Little Lord of the Rings reference there. And so what I think is that there should be a separate password management system specifically for administrative passwords. And that would be either administrator in Windows as well as the admin rights. You should not be using your Active Directory. Let's say I'm curtis.preston@druva.com, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm administering the backup system, that should not be my administration user ID, because if Active Directory is compromised, et cetera, right?
Sure.
So I think it should be walled off as much as possible from an Active Directory standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And there are systems that will do that for you. There are third-party, right, management systems, right? The other thing has to do with storing the data. We talked about, we use disk. There are ways to configure backups. So first off, don't use a local disk, right? And in the storage world, we say DAS, direct attached storage. Don't use that. That will guarantee that your backup files are sitting there directly accessible as as a file that can be possibly exfiltrated.
Right.
Use a third-party storage system such as these deduplication disk arrays, and connect it to the backup system via whatever proprietary system they offer that allows the data to be transferred and stored in that system, but not seen directly as files, right? That's a really big one, and that's the most common mistake, I think. I think those two mistakes that I just talked about are the most common mistakes. They connect it to Active Directory, they don't secure it separately, and they have the backups, even if they're on a separate system, they have them identifiable as files. And then the other thing, you want at least one of those copies, the 321, it needs to be on something that is just completely inaccessible to your data center, right? This is why cloud works so well. This is why, like, when you look at S3 and AWS, they have the object lock feature, so you can turn that on so that even you can't delete your own backup data.
Right.
By the way, encryption everywhere, right? Encryption everywhere, and third-party encryption key management, if at all possible. I'm reading a lot lately about the exploit, bad actors exploiting the Windows. I believe it's called the machine key that is used by some products to encrypt. So they use it to encrypt like usernames and passwords for the system. And unfortunately, that means if someone has hacked, like if you Google, how to decrypt backup data from certain vendors, you'll find ways on the internet to decrypt that machine key.
Right.
And then once you have that, you can authenticate as anything. And then what they do, instead of just copying the data, they can restore the data.
I see.
And they can restore it to wherever they want, right? So you should be watching for those things too. That's harder. watching for weird administrative actions. There are products that are available that I know Druva, we have this, right, where we can automatically, using machine learning, we can say essentially it's not rocket science. It's like you've done one restore a month for the entire time you've been a customer, and suddenly there's 30 restores a minute. Something's going on, right?
It's kind of like
right.
when we say we have machine learning, it's not anyone claiming that they've got AI, is talking nonsense. Right. It's more, pattern recognition over time.
Right.
Once the platform's been there for a little while, and then you can begin to see that anomalous behavior in your AD or your file server, or even your cloud backups.